A wanted fugitive, hiding in plain sight, approached a royal guard with calculated intent. As tourists watched, unaware of the danger, he suddenly reached into his coat and pulled out a gun. In that split second, everything changed. What happened next left the entire crowd in stunned silence. But before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Also, make sure to check out our second channel, Guard Patrol, linked in the pinned comments, because we upload daily at the same time on both channels. So, subscribe to both and never miss a powerful story. The afternoon shadows stretched long across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as guard James Mitchell maintained his post with unwavering precision. His scarlet uniform caught the waning sunlight, each brass button and medal telling its own story of service and sacrifice. 20 years of military service, including 3 combat tours, had honed his instincts to razor sharpness. Instincts that were now quietly screaming of danger. Among the usual crowd of tourists and onlookers, one figure stood out to Mitchell's trained eye. The man moved with calculated casualness, his gait too measured, his observations too precise. While others gazed at the palace's grandeur, this one studied sightlines and patrol patterns with the cold efficiency of someone who had done this before. The stranger's expensive coat seemed at odds with his worn boots, the kind favoured by certain paramilitary groups Mitchell had encountered during his service. His clean-shaven face and carefully styled hair spoke of someone trying too hard to blend in. But Mitchell had seen that same disguised hatred in far more dangerous places than this tourist-filled courtyard. The man began drifting closer to Mitchell's position, his path seeming random to untrained observers, but following a classic infiltration pattern. Other tourists instinctively created space around him, responding to something in his bearing that set off unconscious alarm bells. A mother pulled her children closer as he passed, her expression uncertain but wary. "Quite the spectacle, isn't it?" The man finally spoke, his accent carefully neutral but carrying undertones of something harder, colder. "All this ceremony, all this," he gestured at the palace walls, "pretense of power." His voice carried just enough for nearby tourists to catch his words, their expressions shifting from curiosity to discomfort. Mitchell maintained his forward gaze, decades of discipline holding firm, despite the growing tension in the air. The man's presence radiated a familiar type of danger, not the chaos of common criminals, but the calculated malice of someone with an ideology to prove. "You stand here," the man continued, moving to Mitchell's left flank, "guarding the symbols of an empire built on lies." His voice dropped lower, meant now for Mitchell alone. "But we know the truth, don't we? About the supposed superiority of your civilization." The words carried the weight of rehearsed hatred, of manifestos penned in dark rooms by darker minds. An elderly gentleman wearing a veteran's pin paused mid-step, his weathered face registering recognition of the threat unfolding before him. He caught Mitchell's eye for a fraction of a second, one soldier to another, before quietly positioning himself near a young family, ready to assist if needed. "Your silence is fitting," the man pressed on, his controlled tone carrying threads of growing agitation. "Like all your kind, hiding behind protocol while the world changes around you." He moved directly into Mitchell's line of sight, close enough that the guard could detect the faint scent of gun oil beneath his expensive cologne. The afternoon light caught Mitchell's campaign medals, each one earned in conflicts where similar ideologies had been met with British steel. The man's eyes flickered to these decorations, his expression hardening with recognition. This was no random tourist. He knew exactly what those medals meant, what kind of soldier stood before him. "But today," the man's voice took on an edge of anticipation, "today we'll see what's beneath all this pageantry, what happens when symbols meet reality." His right hand drifted casually toward his coat pocket, a movement that Mitchell's combat-trained senses registered with crystal clarity. The courtyard had grown quieter, the usual tourist chatter dying away as more people sensed the building confrontation. The veteran had managed to quietly usher the young family toward the palace gates, his movements deliberate and unhurried to avoid drawing attention. Mitchell's posture remained perfect, his bearing unchanged, but every nerve and muscle was coiled with the readiness that had kept him alive through urban warfare and mountain firefights. As the man began his next circle, Mitchell counted weapons. The visible bulge of a primary firearm, the probability of a backup piece, the slight asymmetry in his jacket that suggested additional equipment. "You know what I see when I look at this palace?" The man's voice carried a new edge of contempt. "I see the last gasping breath of a dying culture, a culture that's grown soft, weak, content to play dress-up while real power shifts elsewhere." His words dripped with rehearsed venom, each syllable carved from years of cultivated hatred. The remaining tourists had begun to sense the wrongness in the air. Their excited chatter died down to worried whispers, cameras lowering as instinct warned them they were witnessing something beyond the usual tourist spectacle. A group of schoolchildren were quietly shepherded away by their alert teacher, her face tight with concern. "All these medals!" the man sneered, moving close enough that his breath fogged the polished brass on Mitchell's uniform. "Earned fighting for what? Democracy? Freedom?" He spat the words like curses. "Pretty words to mask the decay. But we see the truth. We see how your multicultural paradise is crumbling, how your tolerance has become a weapon against you." The elderly veteran had positioned himself near a palace emergency call button, his aged frame belying the alertness in his stance. He'd seen this type before in newsreels from the 1940s, in the manifestos of modern extremists. The hatred might wear new clothes, but its face remained unchanged. "Your silence amuses me," the man continued, beginning another calculated circle of Mitchell's position. "Standing here, guarding nothing, while your civilization collapses around you. Did you know," his voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, "that we're growing stronger every day? In every city, every country you thought you'd liberated, our message spreads. Your victory in 45 was temporary. The tide is turning." Mitchell's eyes remained forward, but his combat-trained senses tracked every movement, every subtle shift in the man's stance. The weight distribution in his step suggested military training, not British or American, but something Eastern European. The way he handled himself spoke of more than ideology. This was someone with practical experience. "Perhaps a history lesson is in order." The man's voice rose, now intentionally playing to the remaining onlookers. "About how empires fall, about how your precious tolerance, your democracy, your diversity—" He practically snarled the words. "They're all just weakness dressed up as strength. Today, here, we'll demonstrate that truth." A young couple quickly walked past, the woman's face pale with recognition of the hatred in his words. Her partner placed himself between her and the scene unfolding before them, hurrying her toward the gates. The man tracked their movement with cold eyes, his contempt evident in every line of his face. "Look at them, scurrying away," he taunted. "Your citizens, so easily frightened, so soft. When the moment comes, and it is coming, they'll fold like paper. But you—" He turned back to Mitchell. "You stand here, bound by rules and tradition, while I say these things. Does it burn? Does it stir anything in that sanitized, regulated, politically correct mind of yours?" Mitchell's discipline held firm, each word washing over him like rain against stone. He'd faced this ideology before. In the mountains of Bosnia, in the streets of war-torn cities. He'd seen its end result: mass graves and broken societies. The man's words weren't just threats. They were echoes of horrors Mitchell had helped stop before. "Still nothing." The man's controlled facade began to crack, frustration bleeding into his voice. Then, perhaps it's time for something more memorable. Something to show your precious tourists, your multicultural audience, what real conviction looks like. His hand moved toward his coat, purpose replacing pretense in his movements. The elderly veteran's eyes widened in recognition. He'd seen that particular movement before, decades ago, on foreign battlefields. His hand moved toward the emergency call button, but he knew help would arrive too late to prevent what was coming. "You see," the man continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that seemed to freeze the very air around them, each word measured and deliberate, like a surgeon selecting his scalpels. "Words are important, but actions—" His hand emerged from his coat with deliberate slowness, a motion practiced 1,000 times before, each muscle moving with the fluid precision of a predator unsheathing its claws. The expensive fabric of his coat parted like stage curtains, revealing the main act. Sunlight caught the blued steel of the weapon, its dark surface drinking in the light like a black hole, waiting to devour everything in its path. The metal seemed alive in his hands, its well-worn surface telling silent stories of other moments like this, other targets, other consequences. "Actions are what change the world," he continued, his eyes reflecting the same cold gleam as the steel in his hands. "Actions are what people remember long after the screaming stops. Actions are what write history in blood and brass, long after all your precious words about duty and honor have faded to dust." The few remaining tourists froze in a tableau of horror, their holiday photographs forgotten in the face of real danger. A woman stifled a scream, her manicured nails digging crescents into her companion's arm deep enough to leave marks. Near them, a child too young to understand the danger, but old enough to sense it, buried his face in his mother's skirt. The veteran's weathered finger found and pressed the emergency button, but his eyes that had seen such weapons in darker places, never left the scene unfolding before him. He recognized the distinctive profile immediately, check-made, the chosen tool of certain extremist groups who valued its perfect balance of reliability, accuracy, and ease of concealment. Each detail of the weapon told its own story. The slight modifications to the grip, the custom sights, the worn but perfectly maintained finish. Beautiful, isn't it? The man held the pistol with the intimate familiarity of a lover, its muzzle pointed at the ground for now, like a cobra waiting to strike. Every movement spoke of extensive training, but not military. Something else, something darker. CZ-75, modified for special purposes. 15 rounds of purpose, of conviction, of change. His thumb caressed the safety catch before disengaging it with practiced precision, the soft click echoing like thunder in the stunned silence. No cameras catching this moment, no phones recording your precious tradition now, how quickly they run when reality intrudes on their tourist fantasy. Mitchell's eyes remained forward, fixed on that distant point that generations of guards had contemplated before him, but his combat-trained senses catalogued every detail with mechanical precision. The slight wear patterns on the barrel spoke of frequent use, not practice-range shooting, but real-world application. The custom grip showed the distinctive modifications of a particular weapons shop known to service certain extremist elements. The way the man held it broadcast volumes of information to Mitchell's experienced eye. This wasn't the awkward bravado of a common criminal, but the practiced confidence of someone who had pointed weapons at living targets before. "I could end it right here." The man's voice took on an almost dreamy quality, like a poet contemplating a particularly moving verse. "One shot to shatter your ceremony, to show everyone how fragile your system really is." He raised the pistol with theatrical slowness, savouring each degree of elevation like a conductor drawing out a crescendo. Each movement was calculated for maximum psychological impact, the gun rising in micro-adjustments designed to prolong the terror. But first, I want you to do something for me. I want you to admit it's all meaningless. The uniform, the tradition, the discipline, just empty symbols protecting a dying world. Symbols that bleed and die just like everything else. The weapon steadied with surgical precision, aimed center mass at Mitchell's chest where his medals caught the afternoon sun. The man's trigger discipline was telling, finger resting alongside rather than on the trigger, following advanced weapons training protocols. His stance spoke of Eastern European military doctrine, but modified with more recent terrorist adaptations. Everything about his weapon handling confirmed Mitchell's initial assessment. This was no common street thug with a stolen weapon, but a trained operative with a mission and the skills to carry it out. Any last words, guard? Any final defense of your precious system? The man's voice carried genuine curiosity now, as if this was some kind of twisted social experiment rather than an attempted assassination. His eyes searched Mitchell's face for any crack in the disciplined facade, any hint of fear he could savour. Or will you die as you lived, a slave to protocol, another mindless servant of a dead empire? The afternoon sun traced lines of fire along the pistol's barrel, throwing silver reflections across the ancient courtyard stones like dancing spirits. Time seemed to crystallize, each second stretching into infinity as the man's finger began its journey toward the trigger. In that frozen moment, Mitchell's combat-honed senses registered everything with preternatural clarity. The exact angle of the weapon's muzzle, the man's weight distribution betraying his next intended movement, the minute tells in his stance that telegraphed his intentions like signals in broad daylight. Years of training computed trajectories, angles, and response options with computer-like efficiency. Nothing? Not even now? The man's voice hardened with finality, triumph already colouring his tone. His finger tightened fractionally, muscles tensing for the final squeeze. Then, let this be a lesson to all who still cling to the old world. Let them see how their traditions fall before real... His words cut off in a sharp intake of breath as Mitchell moved. Not the ceremonial movements tourists came to photograph, but the fluid precision of a combat veteran who had spent decades perfecting his craft. The transition from ceremonial guard to combat operator happened in less than a heartbeat. A shift that spoke of years spent mastering the delicate balance between pageantry and lethality. Before the man's finger could complete its journey to the trigger, before his brain could even register the guard's motion, Mitchell's hand shot out with snake-like speed. In one fluid motion, Mitchell's white-gloved hand clamped around the pistol. His grip, honed through thousands of hours of training in rain-soaked ranges and dust-choked combat zones, found the exact pressure points needed. The movement drew from techniques refined in close-quarter combat training with the SAS, perfected during counter-terrorism operations that would never make the history books. The weapon seemed to simply vanish from the man's grasp, transferred to Mitchell's control with such smooth precision that several onlookers would later swear they hadn't even seen the movement, just a blur of white glove and suddenly empty hands. Mitchell's fingers moved with the practiced efficiency of a surgeon, each motion deliberate and purposeful. The magazine release depressed under exactly the right pressure, not the fumbling of a range instructor, but the decisive action of someone who had performed this sequence under enemy fire. The magazine dropped free, caught in his left hand before it could hit the ground, the weight telling him instantly that it was indeed fully loaded. The brass tips of the rounds gleamed in the afternoon sun, each one a potential tragedy averted. His thumb found the slide release with mechanical precision, the movement flowing like water. The chambered round ejected in a graceful arc, the 9mm round spinning through the air before pinging against the courtyard stones with a sound like a small bell tolling. His hands continued their ballet of disarmament, each motion a testament to countless hours spent mastering these very sequences. Check chamber, clear. Safety, engaged. Mechanism, secured. The entire sequence took less time than most people need to process a sudden sound. The man stood frozen, his empty hand still shaped around a weapon that was no longer there, fingers grasping at empty air like a magician's audience after a particularly impressive vanishing act. His face underwent a remarkable transformation, from smug superiority to stunned disbelief, then to something approaching fear as the reality of his situation began to dawn. Mitchell completed the disarmament sequence in under 3 seconds, a speed that spoke of similar actions performed under far more dangerous conditions in places where failure meant death. CZ-75B pre-2010 production, Mitchell spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute certainty. His eyes tracked over the weapon with professional assessment, noting details that only years of specialized training could recognize. Modified trigger assembly, custom grip panels from a Montenegro-based supplier, extended slide release, titanium guide rod, modifications favored by a particular group operating out of the Balkans. The serial number's been professionally altered, but the wear pattern on the barrel suggests approximately 2,000 rounds fired, mostly subsonic ammunition based on the carbon fouling pattern. His gloved fingers traced specific points on the weapon as he continued his analysis, each observation a testament to years of intelligence briefings and combat experience. The ammunition is Czech-made subsonic, favored by certain groups for its reliability with suppressors. The magazine's spring has been replaced recently. Serbian manufacture, if I'm not mistaken, not standard issue. The firing pin shows distinctive marks from a particular gunsmith known to service specific extremist cells. His voice remained professionally detached, as if discussing the weather rather than dismantling a would-be assassin's weapon of choice. "Give it back!" the man snarled, his carefully constructed facade crumbling completely. He stretched out his hand, demanding, "Now!" Mitchell's response was as swift as it was decisive. Using the pistol's grip as a pivot point, he brought the weapon's rear sight down in a precise arc. The hardened steel met the bridge of the man's nose with surgical accuracy. Cartilage cracked with a sound like stepping on autumn leaves. Blood erupted from the man's nose, staining his expensive coat. He staggered backward, hands clutching his face, all pretense of sophistication gone. You broke my nose!" His voice was thick with pain and rage. "No," Mitchell corrected calmly. "I used appropriate force to neutralize a direct threat to the crown. The broken nose is incidental." His bearing remained parade ground perfect, even as he maintained full control of the situation, though I should note that attempting to assassinate a royal guard while carrying a modified weapon with illegal ammunition tends to have painful consequences. The man's eyes darted around wildly, searching for escape routes. Blood dripped between his fingers, each drop marking the pavement like a countdown. "You'll regret this," he spat, blood spraying with his words. "We have people everywhere. This isn't over." Mitchell's response carried the weight of someone who had heard similar threats before. "Actually, it was over the moment you revealed your weapon. You see, while you were monologuing about the fall of civilization, you failed to notice several things." His eyes flicked briefly to the elderly veteran. "The silent alarm was triggered 90 seconds ago. Metropolitan Police units are already sealing off all exits, and your face has been clearly captured by no fewer than 6 security cameras." The man's complexion paled beneath the blood still flowing from his nose. The sound of approaching sirens began to cut through the afternoon air, growing closer with each passing second. His carefully laid plans were unraveling faster than the blood could drip from his chin. With a final hate-filled glare, he turned and ran, shoving past shocked onlookers in his desperation to escape. His expensive shoes skidded on the stones as he fled. leaving a trail of blood droplets that would make pursuit trivially easy for the approaching authorities. Mitchell remained at his post, his bearing returning to ceremonial precision, even as police vehicles screeched to a halt at the palace gates. Armed response units deployed with practiced efficiency, their movements reflecting the countless drills conducted for exactly this type of situation. The elderly veteran approached the responding officers, his military bearing evident as he gave a precise report of events. Other witnesses came forward, their shocked descriptions piecing together a clear picture of what had transpired. Each account emphasized the guard's incredible speed and control, how he had neutralized the threat without ever abandoning his post or losing his composure. "Detective Inspector," Mitchell addressed the senior officer who approached his position, his voice maintaining its professional calm. "The suspect is carrying a modified CZ-75B pistol obtained through illegal channels. Based on his accent variations and tactical training, I'd suggest checking his connections to certain extremist groups operating in Eastern Europe." The detective's eyebrows rose slightly as he took notes. "You got all that from a brief confrontation?" The weapons modifications are consistent with a specific weapons modifier based in Montenegro. The suspect's stance and weapon handling suggest training from a particular paramilitary camp. Mitchell's analysis continued with methodical precision. His ideology and phraseology match known propaganda from several monitored extremist channels. "I suspect you'll find he's already in your database." As if on cue, another officer rushed up with a tablet. "Sir, facial recognition just got a hit. He's wanted in connection with several incidents across Europe. Interpol's had a flag on him for months." The detective nodded grimly. "Right. We'll have his photo on every news outlet within the hour. He won't get far. Not with that broken nose marking him." He glanced at the blood trail leading away from the scene. Though I have to say, that was quite a precise application of force. The rear sight of a CZ-75B is particularly effective when proper pressure is applied, Mitchell replied matter-of-factly. "The suspect's nose will require medical attention within the next few hours, making it virtually impossible for him to leave the city undetected." The elderly veteran, who had finished giving his statement, approached Mitchell with a crisp salute. "Royal Marines, retired," he introduced himself. "That was textbook threat neutralization, son. Reminded me of our close protection training in '82. Mitchell returned the salute with perfect form. "Thank you, sir. Though I suspect your generation had to handle worse situations than a single armed ideologue." "Perhaps," the veteran smiled slightly, "but we didn't have to do it while maintaining ceremonial guard protocol." He glanced at Mitchell's still perfect uniform and posture. "I'd say the standards have gone up since my day." As the police began cordoning off the area and taking statements from witnesses, life around Buckingham Palace began returning to normal. Tourists, now held at a safe distance, watched as forensics teams photographed the blood trail and recovered the ejected bullet from the courtyard stones. The detective made a few final notes before turning back to Mitchell. "We'll need a full statement later, but for now, is there anything else you can tell us about the suspect?" "Just one thing," Mitchell replied, his eyes scanning the perimeter with professional thoroughness. "Given his ideology and training, he'll likely seek medical attention from underground sources. I'd suggest monitoring certain clinics in the East End, particularly those with recent connections to Balkan expatriate communities." The detective's radio crackled with updates as surveillance cameras tracked the suspect's flight through London's streets. Every police officer in the city now had his description, every hospital was on alert, and a network of law enforcement agencies was closing in like a net around their wounded quarry. As the excitement died down and the police continued their methodical work, Mitchell resumed his watch, his posture as impeccable as ever. The afternoon sun caught his medals once again, each one a testament to the years of training and experience that had prepared him for moments exactly like this. The ceremonial uniform might draw tourists' attention, but beneath it stood a warrior who had proven once again that the Guards' traditions were built on very real foundations of skill, courage, and unwavering dedication to duty. The elderly veteran, before departing, cast one final glance at Mitchell's post. In that perfect posture, that unshakable dedication, he saw the living embodiment of what their service had always been about, not just standing guard, but standing ready, prepared to meet any threat with disciplined, precise response. What would you have done in Guard Mitchell's position? How many of us could maintain such perfect composure in the face of direct threats, only to act with precise, controlled force when the moment demanded it? These are the men and women who stand guard over our traditions and values, not as mere symbols, but as highly trained professionals ready to defend what they hold dear. Their ceremonial duties might draw tourists' cameras, but their real strength lies in what you don't see until moments like these reveal it. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about the Royal Guards who protect not just our palaces, but our way of life. Press that bell icon to ensure you never miss our latest uploads. Have you ever witnessed a moment where someone's true training and character were revealed in a crisis? What do you think about the balance between ceremonial duty and combat readiness that Royal Guards must maintain? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to check out our previous videos about Royal Guards appearing on your screen right now. Each one reveals another facet of these extraordinary servicemen and women who stand ready to defend our values, whether through unwavering discipline or, when necessary, decisive action.